So in today's lesson, we're going to look at the transmission of pathogens. And by transmission, I just mean how pathogens spread from one person or from one host to another. Before we look at the different methods that they can use to spread, it's important to understand why it is that they spread and why they can spread so quickly. So the reason that they want to spread is that for most pathogens, they can't grow outside a host. So they need the host to be able to grow and to be able to multiply. So it's important for their survival that they infect people. So I'm going to write most pathogens cannot grow outside their host. And by host, I just mean whatever it is that they've infected. So if they haven't infected someone or a plant, then they aren't able to grow and they will start to die off. So it's important for their survival that they spread from one person or from one host to another. Because if they don't spread, then they can't increase in number and they will eventually die out. So it's important for their survival that they can spread from one person to another. That word transmission that I have in the title, that word transmission is just referring to the spreading. The spreading of pathogens occurs in a number of different ways, and the method used for the transmission will depend on the pathogen itself. So different pathogens will spread in different ways. And when you're trying to control the spread of a particular pathogen, it's really important to understand how it is spreading. So this information on transmission is really, really important. So I'm going to make kind of a table. I'm going to put type of transmission, and then I'm going to look at an example, which is basically an explanation of that type of transmission. And the first type of transmission I'm going to talk about is just when pathogens are transmitted or when they spread through the air. I'm going to do this a little bit neater than I am. Okay, so when the pathogens spread through the air. So this typically happens. Let's focus there. Okay. So an example of this is the flu virus. And what happens is an infected person, so someone who has the flu virus, they are prone to sneezing and they're prone to coughing. And every time that they sneeze or they cough, tiny little particles are going to be released into the air. In those tiny little droplets, in those little particles, you're going to have the flu virus itself. So when you're sneezing and you're coughing, you're releasing the flu virus into the air. And the flu virus can survive in the air and it can spread in the air in those droplets and infect somebody else. So I'm going to write flu virus and we're going to explain how it happens. So an infected person, someone with the virus, coughs or sneezes, and when they do that, they release droplets into the air that contain the virus itself. Okay? And then the virus within those droplets can travel through the air and infect someone else. An infected person coughs or sneezes and releases droplets into the air that contain virus. Droplets can then infect someone else. Okay, and the flu is just one example of a pathogen that can be spread through the air. Okay, different pathogens can survive in the air for different lengths of time. So like the flu virus will only survive in the air for I think up to like 24 hours. But other pathogens, so tuberculosis, which I mentioned yesterday, that also travels through the air. It's a bacteria that travels through the air, but it can survive in the air for months. Okay, so it will depend on the pathogen just how long it can survive in the air and how far it can travel before it has to infect another person. So remember, they do need to infect a host eventually because they can't grow and they can't die unless they infect someone, but some of them can survive for quite a long time in the air without dying and can travel quite long distances before they infect a new host. So that's an example of air transmission. Another type of transmission is water. So in some cases, you might have dirty water that contains pathogens. And if you were to drink that water, the pathogen will enter your body. Okay, and a classic example of this is, again, a disease we mentioned in the last lesson, cholera, which is a bacteria. So that bacteria, cholera, is typically found in dirty drinking water. All right. Pathogen found in dirty water. So then it will infect anyone who drinks it. Okay, so obviously if there's a pathogen in the water and you drink that water, that pathogen will go inside your body and can infect you. And a classic example of that is cholera, which is a type of bacteria. Now, we're okay in this country because all of our water is treated. So even the tap water we get from the tap, it's all been treated. It's not going to contain cholera. But in other less developed countries where they don't have a treated water supply, you can find bacteria in their water, such as cholera. And when you drink that water, you can get the disease. So that's an example of water transmission. Just like drinking water, if you were to eat contaminated food, okay, so some food can contain bacteria, and the common bacteria associated with food poisoning is Salmonella. Okay, so you can get this Salmonella, which is also a bacteria. You can find it on food, and if you eat, will infect anyone eating the contaminated food. So that's why it's really important to ensure that you wash your food or that you cook your food properly before eating it. So stuff like chicken, okay, that will be covered in bacteria, but when you cook the chicken, you are going to kill all that bacteria and you will make it safe to eat. But if you're eating raw food or unwashed food, there is a danger that it might be contaminated. If you eat that contaminated food, you can infect yourself. And a common example is Salmonella, which is a bacteria associated with food poisoning. So you can see drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food is a way to pick up pathogens. Another way we can look at is direct contact, so actually touching off somebody else who has the virus. And the most common examples of these are sexually transmitted infections. So one we mentioned yesterday was HIV, but there are a few others that we're going to look at in more detail. So in the case of something like HIV, it's sexual contact. But there are other diseases that you can pick up from non-sexual contact. So in the other video as well, I mentioned athlete's foot, which isn't life-threatening, but it's also not particularly present. It's like a fungal infection between your toes. But with something like athlete's foot, if you were just to touch off someone, I mean, I don't know why you'd want to touch someone's foot if they had athlete's foot, but if you did touch someone's foot who had athlete's foot, you can pick up the disease just by touching their infected foot. A better example, and a more likely way for it to spread, in and around swimming pools, if someone who had a fungal infection on their foot was walking around a swimming pool and then you were to walk on the same area, you can pick it up from just walking on the same ground that they walked on if you are both walking in bare feet. So this is a case of contact, either touching an infected area, if someone's infected with something, or touching the same surface that an infected person has stood on or come in contact with. So HIV is sexual contact, but you can also have athlete's foot. which would be non-sexual contact. It would just be touching of the infected area, or, all right, touching infected area or an infected surface. So you can either touch that infected foot directly, or you can touch a surface that that infected foot has touched. Okay, so that's going to be direct contact. Now, with this one, HIV and sexual contact, we're going to do a full lesson on sexually transmitted infections. We're going to look at HIV in more detail. We're going to look at chlamydia. I think we're also going to look at gonorrhea. So we're going to look at different types of sexually transmitted infections. We're going to look at exactly what is required for those sexually transmitted infections to be passed from one person to another, and how we can prevent them. So we are going to come back and look at this in a lot more detail. We'll do a full lesson on STIs. There's just one more method of transmission that we need to talk about first. And that method of transmission is one you're probably not going to be familiar with, and it's called a vector. So I'm just going to explain what a vector is before I give the example of a disease spread by a vector. And a vector is just an organism that carries pathogens from one host to another. So earlier I mentioned that some pathogens could survive in the air for quite some time before they infect another host. And I used tuberculosis as an example of a bacteria that can survive for quite a long time outside a host, just traveling through the air. But then you've got other pathogens that cannot survive without a host at all. Okay, so they can't just spread through the air. They have to be within a host at all times. An example of that is the malaria protist. So we looked at malaria in the previous video, and we saw it was caused by a protist, which is a type of pathogen. And the malaria protist cannot survive if it is not in a host. So what happens is it stays in a host at all times, and it's actually spread by mosquitoes. So in this case, the mosquito is the vector. Okay, so what will happen is a mosquito might bite somebody that is infected with malaria. So when the mosquito bites that person, the mosquito sucks that person's blood. And when the mosquito sucks that person's blood, it will also suck up the malaria protist. The mosquito will then contain the malaria protist. The mosquito itself does not get sick. It's not affected at all by the malaria protist. But then that same mosquito flies away and bites someone else. And when the mosquito bites that next person, it will transfer the malaria protist to the next person it bites. So if a mosquito bites an infected person, it will pick up that protist. The next person it bites, it will pass that protist on to that person. The protist itself is never outside a host. It's going from the person to a mosquito to another person. So it's always going person, mosquito, person, mosquito, person. It's never outside the host because it can't survive outside the host. Mosquitoes, we call them vectors because they're carrying the pathogen from one person or from one host to another, but the mosquito itself is not infected. The mosquito doesn't get sick. So we call it a vector. So spread by mosquitoes. So I can say, how will I write this? Spread by mosquitoes. Mosquito bites infected person. Then picks up the protist, will pass the protist on to next person it bites. Okay, so and malaria is a problem in certain parts of the world. So in certain parts of the world, you just kind of have to assume that mosquitoes, lots and lots and lots of them, are going to be carrying this malaria protist. So it's a real danger in certain parts of the world. Okay, so we've talked about all of the different ways that pathogens can be spread. In the next video, we're going to look at how we will prevent the spread of these pathogens. And the way you'll prevent the spread will be determined by the way it is spread. So in the next video, I'll go through how to prevent the spread.